It was a dog named Ruka, and a woman on a dirt trail who changed this city forever. February 2nd, 2009. The dog found what looked like a bone. The woman photographed it, sent the photo to her sister, a nurse, who told her it looked human. She called police, and almost immediately, a sleepy arroyo on Albuquerque's West Mesa became the largest homicide investigation in the Albuquerque Police Department's history. I'm Marisa Elena Cortez. This is Still Unanswered. Today, we're talking about the West Mesa bone collector, the 11 women and one unborn child unearthed in 2009 near 118th Street SW, and the long shadow of unanswered questions that followed.
Marisa, thanks for having me. I remember reading the first reports and thinking about how unremarkable that moment of discovery seemed on the surface. A dog, a bone, and how quickly that ordinary walk turned into a reckoning. I teach and research this kind of violence, and for me, the West Mesa case it's emblematic of a lot of structural failures, marginalization, data gaps, and legal puzzles that slow forensic closure.
Yeah. Before we get into suspects and DNA laws and maps and all that, Nathan, I want us to set the scene. Picture the West Mesa, the physical place. You teach and study landscapes like this. Describe it for listeners who haven't been there.
Imagine scrub brush and dusty trails, arroyos cutting the earth, the skyline of Albuquerque faint in the distance, traffic on I-40 a distant hum. In the early 2000s, that area, the West Mesa Escarpment extending toward Rio Rancho, was largely undeveloped desert. It was technically inside city limits, but psychologically it was no man's land, remote, unpoliced, used by locals as a party spot, a cut-through. Between 2003 and 2006, the West Side was booming, developers grading open desert for subdivisions. Satellite images from 2003 to 2005 actually show tire tracks and disturbed soil where the graves were later found. So this place was changing rapidly. It was at once exposed and invisible. That contradiction matters.
Right. That liminal quality, inside the city but feeling abandoned, is where vulnerability grows. I grew up off Central Avenue, and I saw firsthand how people slide into the margins. Poverty, addiction, survival sex work. It's not abstract. Central Avenue, part of old Route 66, was and still is a corridor where drugs and street-level sex work happen. Those are the women who began disappearing. Some families thought their daughter had taken off because she used drugs. That assumption cost time and attention.
Exactly. And the victims found on the Mesa reflect that geography and social reality. The remains of 11 women and one unborn child were dug up in shallow graves clustered near 118th Street SW. The women were between 15 and 32 years old. Most were Latina. Many were mothers. Most had histories involving drugs and street sex work. That combination of transience, criminalization, and social stigma made them both reachable to predators and, tragically, often invisible to the institutions that might have protected them.
Let's name them. I want listeners to hear names, not just numbers. We'll move through some of these women so they aren't swallowed by the nickname, the bone collector. The APD and subsequent reporting identified Monica Diana Candelaria, 22, vanished May 15, 2003. Victoria Ann Chavez, 26, vanished June 5, 2003. Solania Terene Edwards, sometimes spelled Solania, was just 15, a runaway from Lawton, Oklahoma, last seen in Denver and vanished August 17, 2003. Doreen Marquez, 24, disappeared October 10, 2003. Veronica Romero, 28, vanished February 14, 2004. Jamie Katerina Barella, only 15, and her cousin Evelyn Salazar, 27, both disappeared March 26, 2004. Virginia Cloven, 24, went missing April 13, 2004. Julie Cindy Nieto, 24, disappeared July 15, 2004. Cinnamon Elks, 32, disappeared August 20, 2004. And Michelle Gina Valdez, 22, who was 4 months pregnant, disappeared September 22, 2004. 11 women and an unborn child.
When you read the list back like that, Marisa, you feel the weight of it. 2 teenagers, multiple mothers, a mix of local and transient women. Solania's presence in particular suggests movement across state lines, possibly trafficking. And remember, Detective Ida Lopez had been compiling a list as early as 2005, noticing patterns in missing women with similar backgrounds, well before any bones were found. That detective's intuition is a through line here.
Ida Lopez kept a shadow list. She noticed the pattern: age range, ethnicity, overlapping hangouts near Central Avenue and a fairgrounds, histories of arrest for drug use. Families were telling police their daughters had vanished and being told, "She's probably out using," or "She's a runaway." Those responses, that attitude, are part of the story. It's a systemic blind spot.
And that blind spot matters because it provides opportunity. Predators, whether a single offender or a network, can exploit invisibility. The graves were in shallow pits, clustered tightly. The burial activity appears to span 2003 through about 2005. Satellite imagery helps place the disturbed soil in that window. Then developers come in and start grading the land. The 2008 housing crash actually stopped construction, leaving a half-finished retention pond and, unintentionally, preserving evidence that might otherwise have been flattened.
Let's go back to that day in 2009. It's almost cinematic, but the reality is quieter. A woman walking her dog sees a bone. She does what a lot of people might do. She sends a photo to a sister who's a nurse. The sister says, "This looks human." The woman calls police. APD confirms human remains. What happens next, Nathan? The excavation?
Within days, police, the medical examiner, and the FBI converge. They use construction equipment and careful manual excavation, mapping each grave, marking every bone. Over the course of weeks, investigators uncover the remains of 11 women and 1 unborn child in shallow graves within a tight cluster near 118th Street SW. Because many remains were skeletal, establishing cause of death was difficult. In most cases, decomposition prevented a definitive medical cause of death. Investigators suspect strangulation in several cases, but for many victims, the cause remains officially undetermined. The emotional impact on families was immediate and devastating. Confirmation for some, fresh pain for others.
I want to pause there for a second. People hear skeletal remains, and they don't always grasp what that means for the families. It can take weeks for identification. It can mean no closure for a long time. APD used DNA testing and dental records, and sometimes personal items, to identify victims. Jamie Barella and Evelyn Salazar were identified through DNA. Solania had dental work that helped narrow identity since she was out of state. Nathan, when remains are that decomposed, what can forensics actually tell us?
It depends on the preservation. Bones can give age ranges, sometimes sex, sometimes evidence of healed injuries or cuts on bones. Dental records are incredibly valuable. DNA can be extracted from bone, but success varies based on degradation. In the West Mesa case, DNA and dental comparisons were central to confirming identities. But from a cause of death perspective, missing soft tissue limits the ability to determine whether a victim was shot, stabbed, strangled. Ligature marks often don't survive skeletalization unless they damage the bone. So investigators rely on patterns, victimology, last seen locations, contact histories, and circumstantial connections among suspects. That's part of why suspects are hard to definitively link to these graves.
Which brings us to the investigation scale and the thousands of tips. APD called this their largest homicide investigation. By the mid-2010s, investigators had logged nearly 1,200 tips, interviewed roughly 200 women with histories of drugs and prostitution as potential witnesses, and set up an ongoing 118th Street task force. Yet, no arrest. There were leads, there were men of interest, but no one charged. Nathan, let's go into those primary suspects. Start with Lorenzo Montoya.
Lorenzo Montoya is one of the most discussed names. He worked at a local printing company, lived in a trailer about 3 miles from the burial site. He had a documented history of violence toward sex workers, including alleged strangulation attempts, and he reportedly threatened to kill a girlfriend and bury her in lime. In December 2006, he hired a teenage sex worker, strangled her in his home, and was then shot dead by the boyfriend or pimp who became suspicious. After Montoya's death, reporting suggests disappearances that match the West Mesa timeline essentially ceased. That geographic proximity, his behavior, and the timing make him a prime suspect in many investigators' eyes.
But prime suspect is not convicted, right? APD never had conclusive forensic evidence tying him to the graves. And there's that thorny legal detail, New Mexico's DNA law. Because Montoya died in 2006, before charges related to the West Mesa investigation, investigators can't legally put his DNA into CODIS unless he had been charged before death. That legal barrier prevents an easy match that would either clear him or tie him to the scene. APD has publicly supported changing that law.
That legal limitation is a real bottleneck. There's a debate about posthumous DNA uploads. On one hand, allowing DNA from deceased persons to be entered into national databases could solve cold homicides. On the other hand, there are legal and privacy frameworks at play. But practically speaking for West Mesa, investigators have argued that the law prevents them from fully testing hypotheses like Montoya's culpability. And without physical evidence from the graves, no perpetrator DNA publicly disclosed, investigators must rely on circumstantial clues: proximity, method, cessation of similar disappearances after his death.
The other big name is Joseph Blay, Jose Blay in some reports. Nathan, tell listeners what makes Blay noteworthy.
Blea is a longtime Albuquerque resident with a violent sexual offender history. He was known as the mid-school rapist for offenses against adolescents in the 1980s. Later, DNA testing linked him to a murdered sex worker whose body was found along Central Avenue. His DNA was found on that woman's clothing. Investigators who looked into West Mesa noted some potential indirect ties. A tree tag recovered near the burial area traced back to a nursery he frequented. At his home, they found women's underwear and jewelry not belonging to his family, items that could be trophies. A former cellmate alleged Blea bragged about hiring women who resemble West Mesa victims. But again, none of those connections produced a direct forensic link to the graves. He was prosecuted for other sex crimes and later sentenced to a long prison term for multiple convictions.
So you have Montoya, geographically proximate, known strangler, dead in 2006, and Blia, documented sexual predator with items and DNA linking him to at least one murdered sex worker. Both fit parts of the pattern. Could both be involved? Could multiple offenders be responsible for deaths that ended up in the same Arroyo cluster?
It's possible. The West Mesa case sits in an ecosystem where several violent men, pimps, and traffickers operated, and their behaviors overlap. Some investigators and researchers caution against a single killer narrative. There's also the trafficking theory. Perhaps a broader network moved women, and local actors disposed of bodies. But the clustering of graves in a tight time window and area argues for a strong chance of one offender operating repeatedly. That said, accomplices or multiple criminals in the same criminal ecosystem aren't mutually exclusive possibilities.
We should mention other men who drew investigators' attention. Fred Reynolds, described as a pimp who had photos of missing sex workers. He died of natural causes in January 2009. Ron Irwin, a photographer who traveled for big events like the State Fair. Police searched his properties in 2010 and seized tens of thousands of photos, but later cleared him. Scott Lee Kimball, a Colorado serial killer, was reportedly probed, but there's no published connection. None of them produced the conclusive tie.
And that absence of a smoking gun keeps the case in the realm of unsettling possibilities. I want to also highlight the sex trafficking ring theory. Some reporting suggests Central American trafficking routes that touch Albuquerque. Journalist Diana Washington Valdez wrote about this as a possible thread. Solania Edwards, the 15-year-old from Oklahoma last seen in Denver, raises the question, were some of the victims trafficked across state lines? If so, a trafficking network with buyers, handlers, and local enforcers could change the dynamic from a lone serial killer to organized violence across jurisdictions. That complicates evidence gathering because different agencies in different states may not see the pattern in real time.
There was even an anonymous tip linking the murders to a man from El Salvador. Details never made public, no arrest. It's a tangle. And while investigators chased leads, families were left waiting. Julie Gonzalez, sister of Doreen Marquez, became a public advocate, speaking about the way her sister and the others were dismissed early on. She said repeatedly that families were re-traumatized by each new discovery near the Mesa. Nathan, what does that feel like for families, this repeated reopening?
Families describe each new search as a flashback. When bones are reported or when detectives dig, it recreates the initial trauma, the hope, the dread, the confirmation. For families already mourning, it's renewed grief and often renewed anger at perceived institutional neglect. The fact that many of these women were mothers compounds the harm. Children left without mothers, birthdays missed, unanswered questions about why no one stopped it sooner. Public memorials, like the Women's Memorial Park, opened June 27, 2020, provide a place for ritual and remembrance, but they don't substitute for prosecutions or why answers.
We'll come back to the Women's Memorial Park and the $100,000 reward, but I want to spend time on the forensic and legal roadblocks, the things that literally stop investigators. We already touched on decomposition and DNA law. There were also limitations in missing person data systems in the early 2000s. Police forces didn't always cross-reference adults with similar profiles across agencies. Ida Lopez had a list, but it took years before a systemic review connected the dots. Nathan, how common is that kind of data fragmentation?
Very common, especially 2 decades ago. Missing person data for adults is often held in local jurisdictions, state systems, and the NCIC at the federal level, but the records are sometimes incomplete, inconsistent, or not cross-referenced for patterns. Agencies were under-resourced and lacked the analytic tools we use more commonly today. Part of the response to West Mesa involved updating technology and grants to allow better cross-linking of tips and missing person data. But those reforms came after a cluster of disappearances already occurred. The lesson is that pattern detection requires both human attention and data systems that speak to each other.
It's infuriating, preventable in some ways. Another thing, APD received nearly 1,200 tips. That sounds like a lot, but tip volume without the staffing to follow up leaves stones unturned. The special 118th Street Task Force persists, even now. What more could be done from your perspective, Nathan?
3 things at once. First, legislative fixes. Allow law enforcement the limited ability to upload DNA from deceased suspects into CODIS under strict judicial oversight to solve cold homicides. Second, invest in data systems so that missing person reports, arrest histories, and victimology can be cross-referenced quickly across jurisdictions. Third, change policing culture around marginalized victims. Treating disappearances of people who use drugs or who do sex work with the same urgency we would offer other victims. Those are policy levers. And community outreach, building trust so that sex workers will report unsafe clients and cooperate as witnesses, is equally vital.
Those are reforms that might prevent future tragedies. Now, listeners of true crime often ask, was this the work of one man? The cluster seems to say yes, but the existence of violent men like Montoya and Blia, along with pimps and traffickers, makes the single killer narrative messy. Nathan, how do we balance pattern analysis with the messy reality of overlapping criminal actors?
You balance it by holding open multiple hypotheses. The clustering of graves and concentrated time window suggests a recurrent offender with access to that dump site. Montoya's death, aligning with the cessation of similar disappearances, is a strong clue. But other men in the local ecosystem had motives and opportunities. A trafficking ring could explain some victims' transience. The truth might be a mixture. A primary offender who used local networks, or multiple offenders whose crimes ended up in the same arroyo. Investigators must test each hypothesis against forensic evidence, timelines, and corroborated witness accounts. But when forensic evidence is limited, the work becomes slower and more complex.
Let's talk a minute about the media framing. The phrase West Mesa bone collector is a media creation. APD typically refers to the 118th Street serial killer. The moniker bone collector is marketable, but it risks mythologizing the killer and obscuring the victims. How do you see that tension?
There's a double edge. Catchy monikers get attention, which can produce tips and pressure on authorities. But at the same time, they can fetishize the offender and turn a chain of human tragedies into a lurid narrative. Families have at times expressed frustration that media focus on the bone collector overshadows the women themselves, their names, their children, their lives. Responsible coverage centers victims, contextualizes systemic failures, and avoids glamorizing the unknown perpetrator. That's the kind of coverage you've built your show around, Marissa.
Thank you. I try. We need to keep their names in the conversation. Speaking of memory, the city created Women's Memorial Park on June 27, 2020. It's a 1-acre park on the site, plaques with victims' names, a place to grieve. There's symbolism there, turning a killing field into a memorial. But families say it's both cathartic and haunting. They still want arrests. There's also the practical thing. A $100,000 reward remains. As of the latest public reporting, APD continues to retest evidence as technology improves and to push to change DNA laws.
And that ongoing work matters. Forensic techniques have improved. Extraction from degraded bones, better sequencing methods, and retesting can yield new matches. But it also depends on legislative frameworks and interagency cooperation. Some survive only if there's money for labs, for staff to follow old tips, and for legal levers that let investigators get the data they need. The fact that APD is still active on the case years later gives families a base for hope, even while the hurt remains.
Listeners sometimes ask, are there more graves? After the 2009 dig, there were later scares. Bones found in 2018 that turned out to be ancient, for example. Ground-penetrating radar and subsequent searches as late as 2021 were done in neighboring areas, but no additional victims were definitively linked. Detective Lopez and others have also continued to track a list of missing women who weren't found on the Mesa. Women like Darlene Trujillo, Martha Jo Lutcher, Anna Love Vigil, and others who vanished between 2001 and 2006 and might or might not be connected. That list raises the haunting question, is the 11 a floor or a ceiling?
That's the core uncertainty. 11 identified victims is what we can say for certain. But Detective Lopez's early list and the cases of missing women in the same time and geographic window suggest there could be more victims, connected by circumstance or location. Some families feel excluded because their loved ones aren't in the official West Mesa roster. We should take seriously the possibility that the 11 are a part of a wider pattern of violence against people whom society failed to protect.
Let's return to investigative details briefly. Satellite imagery showed disturbed soil and tire tracks 2003 to 2005. Mapping the graves helped investigators sequence burials. Michelle Valdez's burial appears to be the last, likely in 2005. Ground-penetrating radar was used in later searches. APD had to sift through some 1,200 tips. They interviewed roughly 200 women with drug and prostitution histories as possible witnesses. That's a huge workload for any department.
Huge. And remember, tips aren't all equally actionable. Many are anonymous, many repeat public speculation. Following up requires manpower. The 118th Street Task Force kept at it. They also relied on collaboration with the FBI and the state medical examiner. Where forensics was limited, victimology and traditional detective work had to carry more weight. That's painstaking, and it's why cases like this can remain unresolved for years.
Nathan, let's talk about comparisons. The West Mesa murders aren't unique in the Southwest. David Leonard Wood in El Paso, the desert killer, also targeted marginalized women and dumped bodies in desert outskirts. He was convicted. Comparing those cases can teach us things: patterns of remote dump sites, targeting of marginalized women, and the ways prosecutions succeed or fail. What lessons did these comparisons offer investigators?
Comparative cases reveal common modalities. Offenders using remote arroyos or desert fringes that straddle jurisdictional lines, targeting women who are less likely to be immediately missed by institutions, and using anonymity provided by interstate corridors. The critical difference often comes down to evidence: DNA matches, eyewitnesses, and preserved material evidence that allow prosecutors to bring charges. In cases where evidence is sparse, prosecutions become much harder. So, lessons include investing in forensics, prosecutorial strategy, and prevention, community outreach, and services to reduce vulnerability.
We're approaching the end of our conversation, but I want to leave listeners with the open questions, the kind we live with on Still Unanswered. 1. Single killer or multiple? 2. Why did the murders stop? Or did they? Montoya's death in 2006 is tempting as an answer. He dies, disappearances stop. Coincidence or the key? 3. What about the missing women, never found? 4. Systemic neglect. Would this have been solved sooner if victims had been middle-class women? And 5. Could the answer already be sitting in a tip file that wasn't followed up? Nathan, what would you say to people listening who want to help?
Call the tip lines. APD maintains a tip email and numbers for the 118th Street Task Force and Crime Stoppers. Even seemingly small details matter. A name, a photo, a vehicle description. For those in positions to influence policy, push for legislative change that helps cold case investigation, including reasonable, transparent rules about uploading DNA from deceased suspects when it could solve violent crimes. And for journalists and listeners, keep centering the victims and their families, not the myth. Humanize them. Keep their names in circulation. That sustained attention is one of the forces that keeps cases alive.
Yeah. And for the families, for children who lost mothers, there's a quiet demand. Tell us the truth. Give us the why. Bring somebody to account. I'll read the tip lines, Nathan, because we want this episode to be useful. The city of Albuquerque's website maintains a West Mesa homicide investigation page with contact information. Crime Stoppers also takes calls. The reward currently sits at $100,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. Before we close, any final thought?
Just that this case is a reminder of how violence works at the intersection of geography, policy, and prejudice. Remote places like the West Mesa become disposal sites because people are made invisible by stigma and neglect. If we want fewer West Mesas, we need better data, better laws, and a public commitment to the dignity of all victims. Otherwise, we risk learning the lessons too late.
Thank you, Nathan. For listeners who want to learn more, the sources for today's episode are available on our show notes: APD's West Mesa Homicide Investigation page, the Wikipedia entries that compile reporting and victim lists, People and CBS News coverage, and links to reporting by Diana Washington Valdez on trafficking angles. We relied on official victim names and public reporting to center the facts. This case remains open. It remains unsolved. It remains, as always on this show, still unanswered.
And to anyone out there who might know something, please come forward. Even a small piece can change this story for the families involved.
Thank you for listening. I'm Marisa Elena Cortez. That was Dr. Nathan Ruiz. We'll keep covering West Mesa and cases like it, because the work of remembering, of seeking, and of demanding accountability is never finished. Stay safe out there. If you have information, contact the 118th Street Task Force through the City of Albuquerque website or call Crime Stoppers. We'll be back next week with another Still Unanswered.